I want food for myself.
1969, I got ambitious and wanted to try a major stream. This would be with a very, very competent group, because you need a competent group, generally speaking, on something like the Dubawnt River, kilometers. You see it outlined there on the map. Our party of 6 in 3 canoes included George Luste, George's dear friend Dick Irwin, and a number of others that were very, very good paddlers. Got ourselves to the north shore of Lake Athabasca in Uranium City. Here we're taking off a very short height of land route out of Uranium City and going to the headwaters of the Dubawnt. I was big on running entire river lengths in those days, and so we traced the maps back right to where the river precisely began. And that's this little pond here, lovely little pond. It was July 4th when we landed, but there were no fireworks, no hot dog stands here, just a nice pristine sand beach. This exemplifies the phrase, great oaks for little acorns grow. As many of you know, the Dubawnt is a massive stream when it gets rolling, but these headwater spots are very special, and luckily for us, the Dubawnt was fairly forgiving in here by letting us pass. We're waiting, and we're not even getting our knees wet. Our ankles are barely wet, and moving the canoes along. Here's Bob Herndon in my bow, and we've got an 18-foot drum moving along. In this picture, we bumped into a nice beaver dam, or beaver lodge, I should say, but it shows how quickly these streams gather their water and how they move along very, very briskly, quite quickly. Here's Dick Irwin in the stern and Herndon in the bow. Herndon pulling a nice cross straw there to avoid rocks as the current picks up and gradient steepens a little bit, and we move along. It wasn't just running rapids though and waiting with the boats. We had some portages in this section that were fairly arduous because, of course, there was no trail. And at one point, one of our members became lost. Mark Rubin lost with his canoe, and we had to go and find him. Luckily, we did. Otherwise, I would have had some very embarrassing explanations to make to his father back in Washington. Here's George and Mark in the evening interlude. George contemplating his journal, Mark helping with the fire. Now these next 2 pictures I'm going to talk about a little bit further on, but they exemplify something I want to try to tell you. It's not my role really to try to tell you experienced paddlers very much at all, except there are a couple points that stick in my head that I do want to get over. And one of them, I don't care where you are, but if you're in a canoe, watch your weather. Be very careful when something like this is seen and you get that little bit of extra wind, that little puff in your cheek that you feel. Where did that come from? What's going on here? What is the weather in store for me? This is exactly what happened on Wilderness Lake on the Dubawnt River. We felt this, and for one of the very, very few times in my tripping, I said to the other boats, turn around. We're going back. We're not doing this crossing. Not right now at any rate. Don't do it. It was about 4 kilometers or so, and just don't do it. Head for shore right back there, 100 meters or so. We're going to camp right now. I don't care if it is 3 o'clock in the afternoon. We're going to stop. We're not going out in that weather. Here they came back, and we sat out for the evening, put our tents up, made our meal, and we sat out a pretty stiff storm. Had we pressed over Wilderness Lake and tried to cross in ignorance of this and in sort of defiance of the weather, we would have been looking for a great deal of trouble. We did not do that. Here's Dick Irwin contemplating the next challenge we faced on the Dubawnt, which was ice. As much ice as I've seen on any river been on. Rainbow or not, there's no pot of gold at the end of that one. It's just a lot of hard work and to get into it, but it turned out to be doable. Now I've got a couple pictures showing our group on the Dubawnt, all of us happily smiling, grinning away there. And this picture is meant to be paired with this one. That's the same crowd about 40 years later at the Holbert Outdoor Center down in Fairleigh, Vermont, where everybody except young Mark Rubin is gathered. So there we were, and there we are again. A little bit of white on the, a little bit less hair. If I scratch the top of my head nowadays, and back then it's not much there, but just a little skin left. On Dubawnt Lake, the Carey Lake Cairn is well known. There's a cairn at the top of this, started by J.B. Tyrrell, I believe, about 1893. And we contributed a note to it. Must say the Arthur Moffat party that preceded us in 1955 also left a note there. And there is a book to be published, I believe, early next year on this particular cairn and the notes in it. And I'd be happy to get a copy because one of them is our trip's note, and it'd be very nice if it was preserved, in my own opinion. If you look just a little bit behind the rock and at the base, Dick Irwin's on the right there, he took the picture on his timer, you'll see a line of white, and there is more ice coming up. I put a couple pictures in here to show the caribou we saw on the Dubawnt River, staple of life in this part of the world. And sometimes, of course, their heads are just on the beach. Here's George and Mark Rubin with what looks like a half deck on their Grumman, paddling the rapids that lead into Dubawnt Lake. These are all paddled after scouting, I might add. We do not go down a rapid like this just helter-skelter. As we entered Dubawnt Lake, it was a day that had hypothermia written all over it. This is cold weather, this is damp weather, this is weather you don't want to be in the water. And we luckily went through all of these little chutes quite successfully and came out on the north shore of Dubawnt Lake, which we were going to skirt for roughly the next week. And that's average time. This is one of my favorite canoe trip pictures. It exemplifies what Bruce Hodgins and Gwyneth Hoyle were talking about in their book, Paddling North into the Unknown. Here's the feeling of the unknown, feeling of the uncertainty, feeling of what have you got inside you that's going to help you press ahead into all this. But we did press ahead. When we pressed ahead, it was sort of like the Antarctic out on Dubawnt Lake. It was fine for aluminum canoes, actually. Aluminum canoes sail across this ice and camel ice, rotting ice, quite successfully. But Dick Irwin's canvas and wood canoe that was fiberglass covered did not sail so easily. And he could not drag it and was forced to do a lot of extra portaging en route. Here we're thinking we're paddling, but we're really not. I think that boat is basically stationary in Dubawnt Lake, and these people are going to have to get the heck out of there and do a walk job. Now, I mentioned George had joined us, and George was awfully helpful on the trip, and one of the ways was his display of fishing skills. George was always an enthusiastic fisherman to my eye, even from the very beginning. It's a famous picture of he and Linda back in the Algonquin Park days when she wondered what she was getting in for, probably. Well, we were on a long channel, skirting some ice in one shore, when George took a cast and hooked a very, very nice lake trout. And then he said, "Where's the landing net?" Well, we fumbled around and looked everywhere. We had forgotten the landing net. There's no landing net. So George gave a quick look, but he took matters into his own hands. No hesitation, no problem. Just jump in and grab the fish. And here Dick's getting a picture of with his camera lens just about down the fish's mouth. And the fish was still on, the lure was still on, and the reel and the line were still attached, and George started running inland there. He said, George, you can stop now. Stop, it's okay. I mean, it's 30 meters in. Put the fish down. And he wanted to make sure he got it. He did. Happy man. Happy dinner. Here's what happens to a canvas and wood canoe when you do a little bit of dragging. And Dick was doing the minimum. He was doing a lot of portaging with whoever his partner was at the time. We got along Dubawnt Lake, but he showed great perseverance in trying to repair the boat each night, loving repairs, but it was extremely necessary for him. It also shows on Dubawnt that we were putting up with some less than ideal campsites. If you can find a level spot there for a tent, you're better than I am. At the end of Dubawnt Lake, there's something called Outlet Bay that many of you are familiar with. As you leave the lake, it's a very, very big bay. And top of it, one side of Outlet Bay, just after we left Brook Camp in the morning, there was a little blip on the top of the hill. I didn't notice it, Dick Irwin noticed it. And we were all sort of ready to scout the ice ahead in Outlet Bay. So we walked up to the top to see what the blip was. That was sort of secondary in our minds. We wanted to just look ahead over to the next section of water, see where the leads were. But what we found up there was a remnant of the Arthur Moffat expedition in 1995, the one, of course, as many of you know, where Moffat, the leader, did not make it out. And we found a cairn left by the Moffat party, and here we're opening it up. This has been discussed in the last issue of Mustagan, the summer issue. I wrote a short story there, and here I'm opening the can, and we're looking at the note that Moffat left. Here's the note, again a famous photo taken by Dick Irwin. The last sentence of it reads, "Game is plentiful and our pots are always full." Written, I believe, on the 27th or 28th of August, 1955. I'll come back to this in a minute. To get out of Dubawnt Lake, there's a heavy bit of current. Those two canoes that are coming towards you now are not going to go very much further. They're going to be stopped pretty close to where they are, where the photographer is at least, because if you turn around and look downstream, it's not runnable water. Heavy canyon at the outlet of Dubawnt Lake, and it was about at least a 4-kilometer portage here before we got to the next lake, Grant Lake, which was doable and marked the end of the ice for us. Here's young Mark Rubin on the portage. You'll notice in addition to the usual junk, he's carrying a log. This was something I always liked to do as we left timberline and headed into a barren land environment, was pick up the last big piece of wood that we had around. A log of this size will make campfires for another week easily. I could get a week's fires out of that size of a log, and something I always wanted to do rather than a gas stove or anything like that. By the way, the introductory slide you saw that had the nice reflection of the small canoe on it at the very beginning of my talk was Grant Lake at the end of Dubawnt Lake. And this is another scene looking from the north end of Grant Lake towards the south. That's Grant Lake in the distance there. And this is taken from an Eskimo blind that we all marched up to investigate. It was a fascinating little place here. There was a natural crossing point for caribou down here. The Inuit would hide on their little blind here, and they would form stone tools, scrapers, spear points, knives, that sort of thing, and put them together and wait for the animals to come. So we made our own collection here. Ours was the third collection from this site. The first one was made by the Moffat people, the canoe trip party there in 1955, and then in about 1958, archaeologist from Dartmouth by the name of Elmer Hart came along and made a second collection, and a monograph was published about it by the Arctic Institute. We made a third collection and gave our specimens shown here to the Museum of Canadian Civilization near Ottawa. Next, I'm going to show you a picture that I don't think has been seen before. Some of these are familiar images related to the Moffat expedition, and this next one is not, I don't think. This is the rapid where Arthur Moffat died. What had happened is they fell seriously behind schedule, and there is a dispute between various members of the trip that are still with us about, I think, what actually happened on the trip. But one thing that I think I've understood is that they made a rule because they were at the middle of September here. No place for anybody to be in the Barren Lands in a canoe. Way off of Baker Lake, hundreds of kilometers from Baker Lake. And they made a rule that if the rapid looked good from the top, they'd run it. You do what? That's like playing Russian roulette. Look good from the top. Well, they finally found a loaded chamber here. The river comes from the right side of the photo. This is taken by Dick Irwin. Right through those ledges. It starts off in a little section of ripples, and then you go around the point. And if you're not ready for this, these are the rapids going into Marjorie Lake. If you're not ready for this, there are some serious ledges there. They're going to eat your boat up. Those are big ledges, particularly the last one. Again, as many of you know, 2 out of the 3 canoes swamped. And in my opinion, the surviving canoe made a mistake because they picked up the pack sacks first and the people last. I would have done it in the reverse order. You want to get the people out of that cold water. You don't know what it can do to you, and you know what it did to Arthur Moffat. Now, apparently, this was the 14th of September, 1955. Some people in the Moffat party maintained that they were very, very disturbed about the slow pace of progress of their trip up to that point. And they wanted to get going, get moving more quickly. Well, I'm not sure they did. And the reason I'm not sure, and I'm still confused about what happened on that trip, is that if you measure the distance from the cairn that he left on Outlet Bay to this rapid, you've got 102 kilometers. It took them 17 days between the date the note was written and the 14th of September when Moffat died. It took them 17 days to go 102 kilometers. That's 6 clicks a day. Canoeing? 6 kilometers a day? We did a little better than 20 in our trip, and we didn't think we were straining ourselves. And so at 6 clicks a day, I mean, I could crawl on my hands and knees about that rate of speed, and I just don't know what was going on. And if you call that picking up the pace of your trip, and that's what the result is, it's very surprising to me. Here's the last rapid on the river. This is actually now, it's called the Thelon here. And here Mark Rubin and I are shooting through a bit of heavy water. We had a great send-off from Yellowknife when we flew out of there to head north to the Hood. Yellowknife had a little distance. The Hood is not a long river. It's only about 350 kilometers. But we added distance, and we ended up ourselves packing on a bit of about 100 kilometers near Tackajack Lake and an inflow into Tackajack. Before we left Yellowknife, we had a great send-off, wonderful send-off at the Wildcat Cafe. The Wildcat, as many of you know, is downtown in the old town, right near the float base for the airlines. And the Wildcat will give you a great breakfast to get you rolling on your canoe trip. Pancakes, sausage, bacon, orange juice, everything you want. And a cup of coffee. Well, this is sort of little protein in the coffee there served there, but I don't think that's so bad. We could almost do it upright and have a new recipe for Starbucks or Tim Hortons or something like that, and call it. Here's we're off the northeast corner of Tackajack Lake, doing our sort of added distance now before we reach the hood. And here I wave to the morning. We took off down a long bay as we approached Tackajack Lake. It's one of those situations where we had a National Geographic photographer along on this particular trip, and this is the one where we did have success with the magazine, by the way, in the January 1986 issue. But they're going down a long bay towards Tackajack Lake, coming in from its northeast corner, looking at one of those barren hillsides at least a kilometer ahead. I thought I saw the hillside twitch just a little bit. It's funny. Then it moved. It's not a hillside. It's a hillside covered with animals. This is one of the three great barren land herds I learned later. I believe the Bathurst herd. At this time of year, just wandering around. They're not in a migratory phase here in early July. The cows have dropped their calves and they're all just getting together and wandering back and forth. The natural reaction by one of us was, gee, how many do you think there are? The answer to that was pretty easy. Just count the horns and divide by 2. We encouraged John Schultz to, he's on the cover of the book, by the way, that I've just done. We encouraged John Schultz to get in there and mix it up with a caribou. And he's not molesting him or anything. He's just sitting there minding his own business, and the caribou are ignoring him. And as you know, here's the trails they leave. This looks like almost an Algonquin Park portage rather than a naturally made animal trail. On Tackajack Lake, there was mist over the ice. It's a lovely, lovely day to paddle across here to get from the northeast to the northwest corner where we portage into the hood. Reflection. I sometimes get this picture upside down. And then we hit ice, and sometimes it was hard going in the ice. Slush ice, brash ice as they call it. And it's particularly hard if your sternman isn't doing a damn thing. And you're the only one paddling. And here I'm doing my little thing in the bow, and Charles Bond is resting on his oar in the back end of the boat, unbeknownst to me. Here's my picture of our camp just before we portaged into the hood. This I call our ducks in a row camp, because the tents are all out there in a row, canoes are all out there in a row, supper being peacefully prepared, and life is good. The upper hood is quite rapid, as many of you know, and you can see the rocks here just ahead of our bow. Here's Charles Bond in the bow, and I'm in the stern that day, and we just got to scout this very carefully, because the pillow of water over those rocks is very, very thin. And then you've got to do a walk job every now and then, mandatory portage, but these portages are not arduous. You can see from one end to the other, and it's a gorgeous view, and just stroll along and listen to the river hum below you. This was about 10 o'clock in the morning, and this musk oxen was sleeping. And we went by, and I thought, well, it's about time you got up. So I shouted something, and the musk ox didn't like it, charged off, and came back with some of his pals. Now, when these guys are above you, it's like the moose on the South Nahanni River. When these animals are above you, and particularly when they've got horns like this that are silhouetted against the sky, you move on down. You get out of the way. Now, I can't do a canoeing picture without a bug shot. And here's my bug shot to tested my bona fides, and I have been up there and survived them. Now here's Great Wilberforce Falls. Wilberforce is not as high as Virginia Falls on the Mannahanny. It's about 56 meters, but it's substantial and it's very, very beautiful. You have less of a water flow here than on the Mannahanny. It's a smaller river, but you have this plunge that happens right in the top center of the picture there. The first plunge, sort of a witch's cauldron of water below it, and then a second plunge, and then to the lower right of the picture, the river exits in a heavy canyon and a heavy flow. Wilberforce was a British jurist. The river was named by Sir John Franklin, who traversed here in August of 1821. British jurist that was instrumental in the abolition of slavery. Wilberforce Falls was very much part of Franklin's first expedition to Canada. Here's an illustration out of Franklin's journal, a copy of which I have in the original, published in 1823, and shows that second fall. You can see there right in the lower left of the picture, that angle is the same as the one they've got there in the engraving. Here's our group again, posing traditionally with the flag of the Explorers Club right at the lit top of Wilberforce Falls. Now Franklin came off the Arctic Ocean after an extended expedition in which he undoubtedly stayed out in the Arctic too long. He should have gotten back to civilization much, much more quickly than he ever did. He overstayed his welcome in the North, and he got hit for it very hard. They came up to Wilberforce Falls coming off of the ocean, were stopped dead in their tracks. They had two 32-foot canoes, and had to make small canoes out of the big ones because they were going to have to do not much paddling on the Hood River. They were going to have to cross down from the Hood, south of the Hood, to hook up with Fort Enterprise down near Great Slave Lake, a bit north of Great Slave Lake, to find their winter base. They almost didn't make it. It was an awful trip that I won't repeat here, but only 9 out of the 20 members of the expedition survived. It was one of the most horrific canoeing, walking, if you will, expeditions in Canada. Well, as I said, Wilberforce stopped them cold. And the thing about the trip that has intrigued many, many paddlers has been this line in Franklin's journal. Now, go around here. The stores, books, etc., which were not absolutely necessary to be carried, were then put up in boxes to be left on cache here in order that the men's burdens might be as light as possible. Well, some of the men were killed by carrying those burdens. They weren't as light as possible. But what Franklin had to do, and he did accomplish, was to lighten his load substantially by leaving supposedly surplus equipment at the base somewhere over Wilberforce Falls. Well, everybody and his brother had looked for that. They've read this journal as well as I had. They'd all looked, they'd all found nothing. So why were we going to be any different? I'll try to explain. Here's a bit of an artist's rendition about what happened, or some of the things that happened on the Hood. There you see Bathurst Inlet on the map, and Franklin's route on red. On the left-hand side is a picture of those freight canoes coming up towards the falls that's below Wilberforce, but just coming off the Arctic Ocean. The right-hand side is the murder of Robert Hood, for whom the river is named by Iroquois boatmen. And here's the National Geographic artist's version of what the remaking of the canoes looked like. The two small canoes shown here being made out of the portions of the large ones, and the cache being prepared right in the center, and one of the people taking the inventory. Just an invention, but sort of a pretty good idea, I think, as to what might have happened at that time in August of 1821. So what we had, what was special, and it's not standard canoe trip gear, obviously, it's a metal detector. Because it seemed to me that enough people had looked and people were confident that the cache or any remnant of it was not above the level of the land. It was somewhere underneath. So we swung this metal detector back and forth over the whole region for 3 days. And this is work because that little weight out there is only a few pounds, but it's pretty heavy. And we got nothing. We got zilch. And I was completely discouraged. And so was the geographic photographer, so was my entire group. And we finally were ready to break camp the next morning. I was down scouting the last rapid, the one below the canyon. And I was walking back, and then I saw Todd Buchanan. It's one of my most exciting moments on a canoe trip. I saw Todd Buchanan standing in the middle of our campsite, jumping up and down, like jumping jacks, waving his arms to signal me and said, "We hit it, we hit it." Wow, hit what? I'll explain. But I have a couple pictures here before I do that explaining of my good friend Joe Letterly, who was with us. Expert paddler down my way. And this is the last rapid in the Hood River. Joe having a good time playing around. And then not so good a time. The amusing thing about this is that Joe, I don't think Joe has realized that he's out of the canoe. He's still got his paddle in the standard grip. And he's still stroking vigorously. But damn it, Joe, that's not going to get you very far. All right, well, what we did to get back to John Franklin, what we did is get ourselves back out to Yellowknife and go in to see the people at the Prince of Wales Northern Heritage Center. We went in there and we showed them some black and white pictures we'd taken. I don't mean movies, just black and white shots, photos of the area, and explained our metal detector going off. And I had one sample item that I'll show you later that I brought out, and they were convinced they want to go back in. Well, again, I was with National Geographic, so we had a budget. So we just hired an aircraft from Ptarmigan, went back in with the director of the museum, Bob James, and his deputy, Chuck Arnold, and they did a serious excavation of the area. And here is there's their transit in the background. They're making a survey. They're getting I'm working the metal detector here in the area we identified from the beeps. And here's the material coming out. This stuff was last dropped here in extremis, I think, by the Franklin expedition, and now it's coming to light for the first time, 1983. And there are those axe heads just being picked out of the muck for the very first time. We found 8 of them all together. We found a file. We found hand-wrought nails. And very clearly what we had were the remnants of Franklin's canoe rebuilding project, where he was making the 2 small ones out of the 2 big ones. That was pretty obvious. There was indeed for us gold at the end of the Wilberforce rainbow. The next 2 pictures, we're getting almost to the end here. The next 2 pictures are courtesy of the Prince of Wales Center. I would have liked to have the original artifacts to show you this afternoon, but they wanted me to do with pictures, and so we will. Here's one of those axe heads. It's marked Foster right in the center there. It was the British supplier of ironmongery to the Hudson's Bay Company that outfitted Franklin's expedition. The cutting edge, as you can see, is heavily battered. That's not just rust from time in the muck. That's heavy battering used at the time, 1821. So that's pretty clear. That's an axe head. But what is this other thing? And what about Franklin's cache? His cache of equipment, books, and gear. This is a brass piece, 2 pieces nailed together that I believe were the corner of a chest. The nails are hooked. The piece has been pried off of something. The top shows a cut in the bottom center of the picture shows a cut. There's been a knife applied or a hatchet applied to this. Just in the dead center of the picture is a bullet hole. Musket ball of about 50 caliber was fired into this brass piece. So what does all this tell us? I think it tells us quite a lot. I think, and this theory has not been disputed, it tells us that this was the last piece of the Franklin cache. The Franklin cache was laid in on the surface. The expedition had no shovels. We know that from equipment lists. So you can bury anything, and they would have had no reason to take shovels to begin with anyway. So they left it on top, shoved it in some bushes near where they were camping, and moved on up the river and then tried to do their hike out. It's found later by Inuit, I don't believe by white people, but by Inuit who had a weapon. Many years later, they were suddenly in possession of quite a lot of wealth. The Franklin items would have been a big, big discovery for them. One chest resisted their attacks, wouldn't open. So they tried to go in through this corner piece, and they shot it, they pried it, they knifed it, they whacked it with a hatchet. They finally got in, took that chest, but this little piece was so beat up that it wasn't even worthwhile for them to keep. So they chucked it aside, and this is all we found. In my opinion, this is all that is left of the famous Franklin cache. Now that theory may be disputed later on, but nobody's found anything since on the Hood River. Well, we've come to the end of my little presentation this afternoon. And I want to thank you for your attention. I want to thank George for his contributions. And I want to thank Wilderness Canada. Thank you.
Thank you, John. I would like to ask the inspiration for this lecture to come up to thank our speaker and say a few words, George Luste.
Just gobbling over here shows my age. I've been sitting down too long. My legs don't work like they used to. But I haven't really prepared a talk. I sincerely thank you for coming here. I thank John Lentz for his presentation and so on. But I thought I would actually bring up two topics that I think are related to all of us. And one of them is happenstance and serendipity. Because I was thinking, how did I meet John Lentz? Well, it's because I went to Johns Hopkins. Well, why did I go to Johns Hopkins? The reason at Mount Allison, when I was filling out forms, Johns Hopkins had a short form. So things happen for strange reasons. And I'm sure in all of your life, too, if you ask yourself, who did I marry and why, and all of these things, you'll find serendipity and happenstance. But actually, another thought came to my mind, John. You're not just John Lentz, you're John W. Lentz. Well, why am I just George Luste with nothing in between? Because I wasn't born as George, I was born as Joris Luste. And when I came to Canada at age 7 in Wawa, kids didn't understand Joris, so they called me George, so I became George at age 7. And I made sure it was put in my passport and so on as I graduated and so on. But that's serendipity of life, I think, affects all of us here. But the second thing I wanted to share with you, and that is basically life. When I was a student at Mount Allison, I mixed up my input-output system. It seems to be faltering a little bit these days. So on occasion, I may say the wrong name or the wrong something or another. But anyways, what I wanted to share with you was, see, I don't think of myself as the canoeist or this or that or so on. I think of us, me, and all of you as being the family of man, basically, the family of this sort of being, this existence. And it reminds me at Mount Allison, as an undergraduate student, I became very infatuated with Albert Einstein and his social, a very insightful, thoughtful, wise man. And I remember a particular phrase that he wrote in one of his little essays somewhere, saying, we're all here for a brief sojourn. And we all know that. I mean, there are a lot of gray hairs here, including mine. There are a few young ones, thank God. But we're here for a brief sojourn. And then he says, for what purpose we know not. See, know not to me meant sort of intellectually, there was no logical reason for what purpose we know not, though we sometimes think we feel it. In other words, emotionally, you can relate to the family of man, to this planet, to this existence, and so on. And I think that actually our canoe trips, the history of the North, the canoes that you have here, I mean, they all kind of relate to our existence, to the family of man, and that's a really, really wonderful thing. So I thanked people like John and the people in this canoe museum and everywhere being part of that landscape, that tapestry, and so on, enriching all of us. Thank you. Thank you again.
We have an opportunity now to purchase John's book, cheaper by the case. John would be happy to sign them. We have more refreshments. The bookstore is there. But before we go on, I want to say thank you to all of you who've come, many of you, a long way to be here. I want to say a special thank you to the Wilderness Canoeing Association, to the Wilderness Canoe Symposium. We are delighted to be able to make a rather more formal connection. The purpose of the Luste lecture is to take the tradition that George has entrenched in the storytelling that has happened in the early winter every year, to bring it to the Canadian Canoe Museum. It's our hope that we will be able to disseminate this through our website and actually build a repository of stories that will go on, because that is really very much ingrained with who we are, but also the canoe is very much attached to that. And George, in his inimitable humble way, just sort of handed a check over for $15,000 and said, here, this is out of the reserve fund from the Symposium, use it as you see fit. Thank you. Of course, we were going to hustle and get one of those big checks printed up and get George to present it, but he didn't want any part of that. It's wasteful. But the Canadian Canoe Museum is built on the backs of energy and love and concern and belief that is in this room. I don't think we've ever had a group of people who represent, led by John Lentz, the kind of river distance that is represented in this room tonight, to this afternoon. But that is what we're about here at the museum, is carrying on that tradition. It's built on the backs of people past, present, and going into the future who will do this. But on behalf of the team that put together today, I would like to say on behalf of our board chair, Ken Powell, who is here, and the staff and the volunteers who made this happen, thank you. I want to say a special thank you to Stacy Reynolds and her crew, who helped make the event happen here, to Chris Miller on the desk, who you met, to Jeremy, of course, who led our tour. I want to say a very big thank you for that. And I will say that I mentioned at the beginning there were 3 book events this fall. This is the second and our third one, and we're just absolutely delighted to be publishing with Cover to Cover, the same publisher that John has worked with his book, the first and only biography of Kirk Whipper, and we're going to be launching that on the 9th of September, and we look forward to seeing you there. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm also really pleased and proud to say that the author of that, Dr. Beverly Hahn, who's a board member here at the museum, is here with us today, and you can have an opportunity to speak with her. This place is about fellowship, it's about communication, it's about communion with the craft themselves. So I do want to say, get a book, but have a chat with people you haven't seen for a while, and do make yourselves welcome, and we look forward to seeing you again. But in the meantime, again, my many thanks, especially to those of you who've come a long way to be here to celebrate the start of something that I hope will go on for a long time.